Hello everybody, it is now 11:25 in the morning on Tuesday, August 24th, and today I'm going to be getting started with Everafter, the final book in the Kissed by an Angel series. Now, if you guys have not watched any of the videos that I have done for this reading series, please go check out the playlist down below. This is a reread series of a series I had read for the first time when I was in high school, and I'm rereading it to see if it was any good. Now, this book is the last book in the entirety of the series, and for those of you that aren't aware, Kissed by an Angel was originally a trilogy written in the 1990s by Elizabeth Chandler, and essentially it was a young adult paranormal romance that involved basically angels and a little bit of demons, kind of, more so in the second trilogy. And speaking of that second trilogy, about 20 years after the original series had been finished, the publisher decided to extend the series a little bit by placing 3 new books in the early 2010s, about 2011 or so, that essentially extended the story a year after the events of the original trilogy. So this book I'm currently working on is the last book in that second trilogy and the last book in the entire series in general. So, to kind of give some background on this, the series follows a young girl named Ivy Lyons who, in the original trilogy, had gotten into a car accident with her boyfriend Tristan, and Tristan ended up dying. But he ended up actually coming back as a guardian angel of Ivy's, and it turns out that the circumstances around Tristan's death and the accident that he and Ivy were in are more mysterious than they appear. And essentially what we find out is that somebody is trying to kill Ivy, and it is Tristan's job to figure out who it is so that he is then able to move into the light and move on into the next life, essentially. And we find out at the end of that first trilogy in the book Soulmates who the bad guy in that is that has been trying to kill Ivy, who's Gregory, which is actually Ivy's stepbrother. But this second trilogy, like I said, takes place a year after the accident, and everything has really changed because at the beginning of the series we learn that Tristan, after the events of Soulmates, had gone away and was not to be seen again. And then in the first book, Evercrossed, Ivy ends up getting into a car accident and dying, but Tristan ends up giving her the kiss of life and bringing her back to life. And while she's in the hospital, they learn about this guy that is there that has amnesia that Ivy ends up befriending. And he goes by the name at first Guy because he doesn't have any memory of who he is or how he got to the hospital. What ends up happening is you find out that Tristan has basically taken over the body of this young man who we find out was originally Luke McKenna. And Luke was actually somebody that the police were after because it was suspected that he had killed his girlfriend Corinne and was then on the run. So a lot of people don't understand, though, that Tristan is the one that took over the body and he's no longer Luke, because what had happened was when Luke died, somehow Tristan's soul had got itself sucked into the body of Luke, and so he has no memories of Luke. Now, in the second book of this second trilogy, Everlasting, we find out who exactly is behind the death of Luke and the death of his girlfriend Corinne, because people are still in that book thinking that Luke was the one that did it, and so he's in hiding. But over the course of Everlasting, Ivy and Tristan basically piece together the real story of what happened. And unfortunately, it does cause another death, which was a friend of Luke's who actually was in love with him, named Alicia. Alicia was the last person to see Luke and had the alibi for Luke. And they were basically trying to figure out how to clear Luke's name, but before they could, Alicia was found dead. And you find out, like I said, toward the end of Everlasting, who the real bad guy of this entire story is, and that is Brian. Brian was Luke's best friend and had basically set him up for murder because Corinne had found a cufflink at a hit-and-run accident that Brian was a part of where he accidentally killed somebody, and in order to blackmail him, basically said that if he, paid her, if he gave her things, she wouldn't tell anybody about what happened because she has the evidence. And Brian played along with this for a while, but then eventually concocted a scheme to frame Luke for Corinne's murder because Luke was known to be fairly unstable from time to time, and so it was fairly plausible that he could have killed Corinne. Now, along with all of this entire storyline going on in this, we also have this thing happening where Gregory, the guy that in the original trilogy had tried to kill Ivy, is somehow back. Essentially, his soul starts to take over the body of one of Ivy's best friends, Beth, after they conduct a seance in the first book, Evercross. Because she's what's called a radio, or a psychic medium of sorts, she's much more vulnerable and takes on the spirit of Gregory, and he starts to have her do pretty nefarious things, more so in the book Everlasting. She starts to lose herself, she starts to lose her mind in a sense, and Gregory starts having her do things that she normally wouldn't do. And partway through Everlasting, we see that Beth learns of a way to try to exorcise Gregory from her, which is by killing herself. And in a nearly successful attempt, Beth is actually able to exorcise the spirit of Gregory, and we don't necessarily know where he goes. Cut to now, the beginning of Everafter. I did read the prologue at first, and essentially what we see is that Gregory is still scheming. We don't know where he goes, but he says that he's going to get inside the mind of a friend of Ivy's, that somebody different from Beth, but is somebody that's still very vulnerable. That's pretty much all we know at this point. We don't know who that is or anything. Now, truth be told, when it comes to Everafter, the only thing I remember about this book is that the overall ending, from my recollection, was very disappointing. I remember reading this back in high school, and my younger sister and I, who had read it together, were really disappointed with how the overall ending was, because it wasn't necessarily something that we would have expected to happen, and didn't seem really fair in terms of the overall story. Now, whether or not that is going to be the case this time for me, I'm not sure, because it's been quite some time since I read the end of this series in general, and two, I don't know whether or not the overall ending is going to make sense more so now. My sister still wholeheartedly believes that the ending of this, years later, is still completely unfair and makes no sense regarding the rest of the story. So that's kind of my big question going on with this, I think, this time around, is seeing if that is still a plausible ending, or if I still believe that it is very unfair and doesn't make any sense. So all I know basically with this is Everafter is taking place right after the events of Everlasting, as can be, surmised, and essentially the fallout of what has happened. I don't know whether or not Brian is going to be alive in this, because at the end of Everlasting, Tristan and Brian both had jumped off of a bridge, and so we don't know whether either of them are still alive or what happens. All we know is that essentially Tristan's soul could be damned if he's dead, and even if he isn't dead, his soul is still in danger because of all the things that he's done at this point to save Ivy and protect her, because according to his angel friend Lacey, who we've known since the original series, she has said that ever since he saved her life early on in Evercross, he's put his immortal soul in danger, and especially since he took over the body of Luke, that has made it a lot worse. And so Lacey had kind of ended Everlasting saying that he's running out of time to redeem himself in some capacity. We're not really sure why that is, or how that's happening, or what, but obviously things are not going well. And again, we don't know if Brian is alive either. We don't know whether or not he's even around, if he died after jumping off the bridge. So this is kind of like a very open kind of beginning. We don't really know much of what's going on. So that's kind of where we are. I'm a little nervous. This book is, I think, the smallest of any of the books that have been written in the Kiss by an Angel series. I may be wrong. It's at least the shortest of the second trilogy, because this book is about 258 pages, whereas the first two books in this second trilogy were both over 300. So I'm also nervous about this, because not only am I gonna, have to figure out whether the ending works, but I already was having an issue with the length of the books in general, all of them with the length, because I felt like they were books that could have all been put together to make one large book in a sense, or at the very least the first trilogy could have been one book, the second trilogy be another book. And I have a feeling that's going to kind of, play a lot into especially this, because this seems like it's the ultimate ending, and it feels like it probably could have just been the ending to one large book kind of thing. So I don't know whether I'm going to like this or not, because I had a bit of an issue with Evercross. I liked Everlasting a little bit more, but I don't think I'm going to like this one nearly as much, which is, unfortunate, but That's the thing with some of these reread series, is sometimes I see that the books don't age nearly as well as what I had originally thought the first time I read them, and that sometimes is the case with any book. Any book that was published in a certain time, you know, is going to fare better in that time than it will years later, because with the production of other stories and better stories over time, the older books don't fare as well compared to these newer, better books. So that's kind of what I'm getting from this. But I am going to basically come to you guys when I've reached page 100, and then we will see kind of where things are going. Hi guys, so I've just reached page 107 of Everafter, and honestly, this is going about as well as Everlasting did, to be completely honest. It's not as, like, intense as of yet, but I'm only now just over 100 pages in, so let's go over what exactly happened. So I did talk a little bit about the prologue, but basically, again, what it was you just see Gregory after the, you know, exorcism from Beth. He causes a lightning strike to happen, which ends up killing a young man in town, and he starts to kind of search for somebody that's also close to Ivy that he could use to basically get involved with, get inside the mind of, and, you know, essentially just take over them like he did with Beth. But it has to be somebody who is more susceptible than Beth was, because Beth did try to fight him often, and so he's trying to find somebody that's not going to fight him as much. And what we learn is in chapter 1, there's a funeral that they go to, which was for the young man that ended up being killed by Gregory, and you find out that his family is looking to sell their beach home that is out there. And then you find out that Brian is actually still alive, and he says basically that he had gone to the bridge to confront Luke because he found him and the police were coming and he was going to turn him in, but they both had jumped off the bridge before Brian could get to him, and so now Luke is basically in the wind and Brian's looking like a hero, essentially. Another part of that chapter, though, does go to Tristan, who wakes up in, like, the bottom of this boat. Essentially, after jumping off the bridge, he swims away far away to where he's in hiding, and nobody knows where he is, and he is still being, you know, haunted by these voices. And Lacey comes to him and she starts talking to him about these voices, and she keeps telling him that he needs to, like, stop chasing after Ivy, that the love he has for Ivy is what's damning him, and that he needs to protect himself, because if they catch him as Luke, he's going to be safe from Brian, who is trying to kill him, as we've learned from the last book. That way, too, he's able to redeem himself and redeem his soul, which is still in peril, I guess, for some reason. Lacey's like, you can't save yourself if you continue to try to save Ivy, but Tristan's like, I'm gonna save her. I'm not just gonna let her be fed to the wolves, basically. That's not how I am. That is not what I'm gonna do to the woman I love. Then we go into chapter 2, where basically Brian comes up to Ivy after some time, and he starts to kind of strike this deal that if she doesn't say anything about what happened on the bridge, then she will be safe. And they kind of just strike this deal because he knows that they now have nothing on him, because the cufflink that they were going to use as evidence is gone. It's at the bottom of the ocean. There's no way that they can retrieve it. And so anything that she says is going to be fought against his word. And so he's trying to essentially weave his way into her life to keep tabs on her and make sure that she's not going to say anything about the fact that he is the one that killed not only Luke, or tried to kill Luke, but that he killed Corinne and Alicia as well. And then it turns out that there's a phone call at the inn for Ivy from a man named Billy Bigelow, which is actually an alias that Tristan uses to let her know where he is. Billy Bigelow is like the main romantic character in a musical called Carousel, which is Ivy and Tristan's favorite musical. And so she goes over to the place where he's staying, and they sit and they talk. Basically, Tristan talks about how he was able to swim away from the bridge and everything, and they're starting to try to figure out what exactly they were going to do now, because they don't have anything on Brian anymore. So they're starting to find a way to maybe figure this out, but Ivy's realizing that if this is going to work, they're going to have to be separated for a little while, because she can't keep coming over to him and risking people finding out where he is, and he can't risk being seen. So they do decide that they're going to separate for just a little bit, just so that they can start getting some stuff figured out, because Ivy sees that the key to the Stedman's house, which are the family that were selling their house. They have the key at the inn, so if she can make a copy of that key, then she can get into their house, and that can be where Tristan stays, at least for some time, but it's going to take a little bit of time for her to be able to get that and do some other stuff, to do some kind of sleuthing and digging around. We go into chapter 3, where Beth finally returns after having gone through the entire ordeal that she did in Everlasting, and it's very, very exciting. Everyone's happy to see her, and you start to actually see that Will and Beth have kind of this romantic connection. I think you could start to kind of see it in Everlasting, where you were starting to understand how much Will really cared about Beth. I mean, he always cared about her, but more so in Everlasting, I think it was really apparent how much he really loved her. And so you start to see kind of like little cutesy things happening here and there, but it's almost like they're trying to be really secretive about it, because, you know, it's also the fact that it's been only a few weeks technically since Will and Ivy broke up, and they'd been dating for almost a year, so it's a little weird, and I think that they're kind of unsure of how Ivy's going to handle it, even though she had been dating Luke for some time. So it's like they're not 100% sure almost how to like go about this entire like thing between the two of them. And what happens is Ivy ends up telling Will and Beth the real truth behind the entire thing, that Luke is no longer Luke, and that Tristan had somehow taken his soul and sunk it into the body of Luke, and Tristan's the one running it. And both of them are able to understand this to some extent, because not only did they see Beth get controlled by Gregory, but both Will and Beth in the original trilogy were taken over by Tristan in a sense, where they could hear him and he could speak through them. So they're not really surprised exactly that Tristan has taken over Luke. They're just surprised nobody had told them, basically, up until this point. What makes me really happy is we actually have a moment where Will and Ivy are able to make up and like actually apologize to each other. But honestly, this is something that should have been figured out way back in Evercross. This should have all come out around Evercross, and it never did, and I'm kind of mad about that, because this is just one of the things I hate a lot with YA contemporary, and a lot of times just contemporary in general, is that when you have an issue with somebody, whether it's a boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever, partner, spouse, whatever it is, there is no communication on that thing, and it makes no sense to have these characters who could so easily solve something by just talking to each other to talk to each other. Like, it just doesn't make sense why this doesn't happen. And I understand that for a lot of people sometimes communication can be really hard. I am one of those people where when it comes to like overwhelming thoughts and feelings, it's hard for me to communicate, but I still make the attempt to try and communicate through other nonverbal ways. And thankfully my husband has been like able to figure out over time what it is that I'm trying to tell him without actually physically saying it, because he can understand my body language and my facial expressions, and he can understand my behavior when I am not okay, to where he can understand, okay, this is not a good day, let's figure out a way to help that. But when it comes to this and other young adult and other contemporary stories, that doesn't even happen. Not even the nonverbal stuff gets ever picked up on, other than Beth, because obviously Beth's behavior was very different than how it normally was. But the thing is that, you know, I feel like Ivy could have just solved a lot of things when she found out that Tristan was in Luke's body. She should have just told Will up front. She should have told him that that's what's happening, because he thought the entire time that she was with Luke that it was Luke she was with, not Tristan. And he says that here. All of the anger and the frustration that was between Will and Ivy over the course of Everlasting could have been avoided if they actually had talked to each other. So then what happens is essentially the girls, Ivy, Kelsey, Danya, they start talking about this idea that, you know, they are going to go to the ice rink to go surprise Brian, who was working, because Kelsey's really bored and it's getting ready to storm, and, you know, they want to go do something, but they didn't necessarily like want to go shopping or anything. So Ivy, though, does take a moment to go copy the key for the house that is the Stedmans. So then they go to the ice rink, and Ivy starts looking around on the pictures there for evidence, something that she can find of Brian wearing the cufflinks that she can use to showcase his evidence. She does find a picture that showcases the cufflink that he has, and it was actually a picture from the banquet he had went to the night that he had gotten in the hit and run accident that accidentally killed somebody. Then we go into chapter 4, where Ivy goes back to take Tristan to the house that the Stedmans had, and she gets him all settled in, and then talks about how she found the picture, and she's not going to go to the police with it just yet. She's going to find more evidence because that's kind of not really helpful to only have the picture. So she decides to stay with him for a little bit, and then Lacey shows up, and she starts showing her first film that she ever made on the TV when she was a little girl. And the thing is, here is it kind of causes the three of them to sit and talk and really understand what's going on, because Lacey tells Luke again, or Tristan again, that Brian is Tristan's enemy currently, not Gregory, because Gregory is still going after Ivy. Right now, she's saying Tristan needs to focus on the fact that Brian is after him because he's likely the one that's going to try to kill him and make his redemption, his soul's redemption, impossible. And Gregory doesn't even know that Tristan's around yet. He has no idea that Tristan's even back in any way. And she says that basically he's no longer an angel. He's no longer able to protect her the way that he wants. And he has to actually protect himself now. And then after that, Ivy goes back to the inn. She doesn't sleep very well. She falls asleep on the beach. And then Danya comes over, and then Brian, and then Kelsey. And Kelsey brings a hair tie that Ivy recognizes as being Alicia's, that Kelsey had found in Brian's car. And she's very jealous, obviously, about it. She's like, Brian, who have you been hooking up with in your car that's not me? Because they're kind of possibly an item. It's kind of back and forth. And Ivy's trying to figure out a way to get this hair tie, but it falls through very quickly, and Brian understands that she knows that that's Alicia's. So we go into chapter 5, where Ivy, Will, and Beth go over to Max's house because they decided that they're going to go to a party, and this is so that specifically Ivy can talk to Max about the boat, because she knows that Brian had used a boat to take Luke out to the water, which was where he left him, and basically to drown. And so Ivy uses this party as a way to talk to Max about, you know, how exactly he could get to this point, and trying to make it seem, you know, very casual. And then she starts talking about the night that Beth and Ivy were in the accident, which was the same night that it supposedly was that Brian had left the party that, you know, she thinks was the one he went and killed Luke, or tried to kill Luke on. And Max kind of gets a little weird. He says that Brian wasn't there. He went to look for him, but he's not really 100% sure what happened, and it's not clear whether he's afraid to say something or he actually can't remember, because it seems like he could be afraid to say something. And then she finds Chase at one point where he's super drunk and he's kind of asking questions about Luke, and he's like, do you know where he is? And Ivy's trying to play it off that she doesn't, and then Brian comes up behind her, and Ivy's like, he's the one asking the questions, not me. I'm not the one that's, you know, providing any information or anything. And then she goes inside and finds Kelsey, who's feeling surprisingly unwell. Like, she's a party girl, she can hold her own, and she says she only had one drink but started feeling pretty ill. And Brian offers to take her home, but Ivy's like, yeah, no, I'm gonna take her home. I'm gonna head home anyway. It's not that big of a deal. Brian basically makes this comment where, you know, he's gonna cheat on Kelsey, which she's like, not like you haven't done that before or whatever. And Brian gets in Ivy's face and is like, we had a deal, you know, you're gonna blow this for me, and you know what, if you're lying, I'm gonna find out, and you're not gonna like what's gonna happen when I find out, kind of thing. And then they take her home, Ivy, Beth, and Will, and Kelsey's doing okay, she's not doing great, and Beth and Ivy start talking about how it's possible that any of their friends currently could get influenced by Gregory, and they're starting to like figure out a couple people specifically that might be, which would be people like Chase, who is somebody that, you know, he's very insecure about a lot of stuff. He's very needy and ambitious, and so he can be very vulnerable because of that. And then they also talk about the idea that Danya could be in somebody because she's very susceptible like she will let anybody tell her what to do. And then there's Max, Max is like this big puppy dog-eyed kid. He's very much like gonna trail everybody around just because he wants attention, that kind of a thing. Then Beth gives Ivy the amethyst that Ivy and Will had given her as a way to try to protect her, because the amethyst had helped protect Beth in some way when Gregory was taking over her, and so they think that maybe it's a good idea for Ivy to have it just to be safe and to have some protection. So then chapter 6, Ivy calls Tristan and is heading to take some stuff over to the house that he's at, and she realizes that she's being followed, and it turns out that she's being followed by Chase. And when Chase gets close enough, Ivy is able to see that Gregory has taken over Chase. He's the one that Gregory has decided to inhabit now, is Chase. And then she calls Tristan and she's like, I can't get over there. I'm sorry. Do you think you have enough supplies to get through the next few days? Because I'm honestly really scared. And he's like, yep, don't worry about it. And then in chapter 7, Philip, Ivy's mom, and Ivy's stepdad, Andrew, all come over because they are staying the night at the inn before heading out to Boston. And so she and Philip are, having fun, playing around, all these things. And then Philip starts asking questions about, Tristan, because he's like, he's not around anymore. But, I realized that he was there one time while we were gone. And she's like, what do you mean? Because they actually had been at the house when Ivy's family was not there in Everlasting. They had gone there to spend a couple of days there so that Tristan was out of, sight from everybody. And he had messed around with this baseball game that Philip has set up out with his baseball cards, and Philip's like, one of my cards moved. It's only something that Tristan would do, so I know he was there. And essentially, Ivy thinks that maybe it's possible for Philip to realize that Luke is actually Tristan, so she takes him over to the place where Luke is staying, Tristan is staying, and at first Philip really doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't know who this guy is, he doesn't understand what's going on. And then they start talking about specifically a memory that Ivy remembers vividly. It's the first memory she ever has of Tristan, especially with Philip. And it's something that you see in the very first interaction they have when you see the flashback of the two of them meeting in the very first book of the series, which is on the night of Ivy's mom and Gregory's father on their wedding night. Tristan was a server who got fired because he was not very good at his job, and Philip was not really happy about this whole thing, so they were found in a storeroom with shrimp tails up their noses, salad greens on their head, like all kinds of silly things, because Tristan was trying to make Philip smile. He was having a really hard time, and Tristan was trying to make him laugh. And that, to Ivy, has always been her favorite memory, because that was the first time that she had really seen Tristan be the kind individual he was, and because Philip also really liked him because of that, it kind of gave Tristan some bonus points, because Philip is the one person that she loves more than anything in this world, and to see her little brother happy with this guy meant a lot to her. And so when Philip and Tristan kind of go back and forth with this description of how they looked, because they're talking about how this monster in this movie they're watching seems kind of silly, Philip looks at Luke, Tristan, and realizes that Tristan's there, and he's so excited. And so then the next part of that chapter is basically Tristan hearing all these amazing things that Philip has done while he was gone, and it's a very sweet and heartwarming thing. And eventually Ivy says that they do have to go, and then after they leave, Tristan actually ends up going to the house that Chase lives at, because it's not far from this house that he's staying at, and he tries to confront Chase because he knows now, based on what Ivy told him, that Gregory is likely in this body. And so he goes to confront him, and Gregory is able to understand that Tristan's inside the body of Luke, and some threats are made, things like that. It's not a very pleasant scene. It's actually, like, I honestly thought at first that there was going to be a much bigger fight, and there wasn't, but it was enough to where I was very uneasy, because Tristan is able to see that Gregory is really in this body, and now Gregory knows that Tristan is around, and so that's not a good thing. So that is where we are. We are on chapter 8, page 107. Much more enjoyable like Everlasting was than Evercrossed. So far I like it. It's not as intense because, again, this is more of like the fallout of this case, whereas Everlasting was the real nitty gritty, getting the details, building the story kind of thing. Now we're trying to find a way to bring Brian down and then also still bring down Gregory. The Gregory thing I think is going to come more to a head in this one, once again, like it did in the original trilogy, but I would be willing to bet that the next 100 pages are going to be a little intense. Hi guys, so it is now going on 9 o'clock at night. Excuse any blue light that comes over here. My husband is currently sitting next to me playing his video games, and I wanted to sit and record because I reached the 200 page mark in Everafter. So we're going to go over the last 100 pages. So we start off on chapter 8, where Max invited Ivy, Kelsey, and Danya and Chase out on his boat, and they decide to go out to this beach area. And while they're there, you know, they kind of just enjoy the beach area, and then a storm comes in, and unfortunately it causes their boat to capsize, and everybody ends up in the water. And later they find Brian, who has a gash on his head, and Ivy realizes that what happened is that in this accident, Gregory had left Chase's body and had taken over Brian's, because it's possible, and is actually the case, that Brian ended up actually dying out there after getting hit in the head, and because his body was no longer inhabited by a soul, Gregory took over, just like Tristan did with Luke's body. And the reason that Ivy knows this is because Brian comes up to her and says, "Vengeance is mine," which is something Gregory would say, not Brian. Then in chapter 9, when they get back, everybody's been freaking out. The boys are put in the hospital overnight. The girls seem to be fine, but Max, Chase, and Brian all end up having to stay overnight in the hospital for various injuries, things of that nature. And Aunt Cindy, the owner of the inn, who's been supposed to take care of the girls, is not okay. She's pretty upset with the whole thing. And what happens is that Beth and Ivy start talking with Will about what actually happened, and Ivy tells them that Chase was the one that overturned the boat, which was true. He had taken over because Gregory was the one in charge of Chase, essentially, and he overturned the boat, which caused them all to get in the accident. But then she does tell them that she sees that Gregory has morphed himself into Brian. And then you start seeing more pieces of that coming to light as time goes on. When Brian continues to interact with Ivy, you get all of the same feelings that you get with Gregory with Brian, because it's very apparent that he's there. And then what Brian tells Ivy at one point is, he says to tell Tristan thanks for the tip. And in this chapter, in chapter 9, still Lacey and Ivy are with Tristan. They've gone over to see Tristan, and what happens is Tristan does end up telling them that he had confronted Gregory when Gregory was still in Chase's body, and Lacey's like, that wasn't smart, that was a really bad idea. And essentially what's happening now is that if Gregory's able to do this, his powers are growing and they're becoming much more dangerous. And Tristan says now that the only way to really destroy Gregory is to essentially kill him in the body he's in. And Lacey's like, no, that's how you damn yourself for eternity. You're not gonna do that, because that's not gonna cause anything other than bad things to happen. Then we go into chapter 10, where we see Will, Beth, and Ivy making dinner, and Chase comes by to pick up Danya, and he talks about how he had likely a seizure. The doctor said that he must have had a seizure when he got in the accident, which caused him to feel foggy and confused and everything, like he had felt in the hospital. And everyone's kind of like feeling not bad for Chase, but still kind of bad for him, because they know he's not like a nice guy by any means, but he definitely didn't deserve what he had gone through with having Gregory in his body. Then in that chapter as well, Ivy and Tristan decide that they're gonna go out to Providence, with Ivy going as Gemma, a undercover like art student thing, in order to kind of get information about Corinne that she had done a couple of different times in the last book, Everlasting. Basically, by posing as this art student, it would make it easier for people to talk with her about things about Corinne. And what they decide to see is if they can talk to this landlord that was Luke's, because essentially they want to know more about, is it possible that somebody else may have had information about when Luke was there? Because if they can for sure set up an alibi for Luke, that will make it a lot easier for them to then establish that he was innocent, kind of thing. And my battery's gonna die, so I'm gonna have to switch to my phone, so give me 1 second. Then after she gets off the phone with Tristan, Max approaches her and he talks about how in the first book of this second trilogy, Evercross, she got into a car accident and had died and was essentially brought back to life by Tristan before he took over Luke's body. And Max reveals that he was the one that was in the car and had killed Ivy, essentially. And Ivy's, like, really not 100% interested in that, in the sense that, like, she doesn't really care that it was Max, but when he starts to talk about how he felt and how he doesn't really seem to remember much, and like bits and pieces have been coming back, and it feels like he had no control over what was happening even though he was trying to be in control, it sounds to her that Gregory may have at one point got inside Max and tried to use him to kill Ivy, which would make sense considering that it was fairly random, it seemed like, when the car accident had happened in Evercross, and it was fairly early on in the book. It was like within the first 5 chapters, essentially. And then through that, though, Ivy starts to wonder if maybe the best thing for Tristan is to stay out of his way, because it seems that all of this was what really started Tristan's downfall, and she feels very guilty of that. Even if it wasn't necessarily hers or Max's fault, the fact of the matter is that the love that they have, while it may be very strong, is also in a sense really causing some issues, which we've already known because Lacey's been talking about for God knows how long, that Tristan needs to give up the ghost and stop chasing after her, because his love for her is what is basically causing him to damn himself. So then we move on to chapter 11, where it's the next morning and Tristan and Ivy are heading out to Providence. And this time they're going to go see a woman that was Luke's former landlady. She was apparently studying for something, but she does have an envelope that was addressed to Luke from Corinne that she gives to him. And it turns out that she had sent him a USB drive of all of her photos she had ever taken, possibly including the incriminating evidence that is needed to put Brian away. So they decide to take it to Will because they can't seem to figure out, though, how to access the photos, and they think that Will might be able to, but it also seems to Ivy that this could possibly get Will in some trouble, so she talks to him about it and she apologizes for that. And then chapter 12, Ivy ends up going with Brian, Kelsey, and Danya to a movie, and at one point during the movie, Danya falls asleep and starts having a really bad dream, and Danya talks about the dream. Danya was on a train bridge, and Ivy was there, and Luke, and she was standing with Luke, and then there was Alicia, and essentially what she saw is that Luke and Ivy had pushed Alicia off the bridge. And what Ivy believes is that this is a seed planted by Gregory to try and get people to turn against her, because Gregory was well known for that. Many times over the course of the original trilogy, he would push people these ideas and thoughts and set up things to make Ivy look like this awful person. And it caused everyone to turn away from her. And then in that chapter, we go to Tristan, who gets visited by Max. And Max knows exactly where he is because he had heard Kelsey talk about how Ivy was sneaking out a lot, and so he decided to kind of try to see if he could find him. And he talks to Tristan about the fact that he accidentally almost killed Ivy, and then he also talks about how he tried to kill Luke. But Tristan knows that that's not possible, and so then we see another instance where it's likely that Gregory has come in and tried to plant seeds in people's minds. And we get more of that in chapter 13 when Ivy and Tristan talk to Lacey. Lacey talks about how essentially he's planting those kinds of seeds and essentially just piecing everything together, that he's using these people to push them away from Ivy and push everybody else away from Ivy and Luke, essentially. And Lacey even says that it's likely Kelsey's going to be next, and she needs to be careful because whatever's going to happen is not going to be pretty. So that when Ivy goes back to the inn, Ivy talks to Beth, and Beth reveals that she's in love with Will, which Ivy already could figure out. She had figured that out way, way earlier, like I had talked about, and so she's kind of trying to be like, you should tell him, but Beth's worried that Will's not going to feel the same way. And then essentially from there, Kelsey and Brian come in, and Kelsey's starting to feel a little unwell. Danya says that when they were out, she was starting to feel very unwell, had almost passed out, and Brian ends up leaving, and then Kelsey in chapter 14 starts to feel a little bit better, but then all of a sudden she starts freaking out. Like, she looks like she's having a seizure, and she wakes up and she's furious with Ivy, calling her this man stealer and that she's always competing for guys. Again, clearly indicating that Gregory has planted a seed in her mind about Ivy, making her look like a bad guy. And then what happens from there is that you see Tristan is hiding in the woods from up behind the cottage, and Gregory shows up, and the two of them have it out. They start talking to each other, and Gregory talks about how he's planning for Ivy's ultimate demise, and he's threatening and intimidating Tristan, and Tristan gets some licks in. He starts beating the shit out of him, and he starts to like listen to the voices that are telling him to kill Gregory, to kill him. But before he's able to, when he has the opportunity, he stops, because he knows it is going to damn him. He knows that if he does kill Gregory in Brian's body, it's not good. And so he's able to restrain himself, and Gregory runs away. Then the next morning in chapter 15, Kelsey's still really upset, and Beth decides that she's going to go see Chase, because I guess Chase has not been doing so well still since the boat accident, and Beth believes that it has something to do with the fact that he's still really confused, and it has something to do with the fact that Gregory had taken over his body. So she thinks that it's a good idea for her to go to see him and see if she can talk to him about it. And Ivy essentially gets Will to admit that he's in love with Beth, and she tells him that he needs to tell her. So then Ivy goes over to the church to play some piano. She ends up accidentally falling asleep and having this really bad nightmare, and the priest comes in to check on her and wake her up. In the dream, she sees a storm coming in, and then there's lightning, and then there's a flight of steps toward a house with a picture window, and all she sees in the window are reflections of the clouds and the trees. And this is similar to a dreams that she had in the original trilogy when it came to the mystery surrounding around what was happening there. And then what happens is she looks into the window again and sees a tall angel statue with an upraised arm, and it tips toward her and the glass explodes in her face. We have about 54 pages left of this now. Let's get into the wire here. There's not much left, and like I said, I think that this is going to come down to how does the overall ending of this story go? Is it going to be as bad as I remember it being, or is it going to actually turn out better now to the point where this could be the favorite of the series? Or is it just going to be another 4-star? I don't know. We'll have to see. Okay, guys, so it's done. Everafter is now completed. It's a 4-star. So let me go over what exactly happened to make it a 4-star. So chapter 16, Ivy starts playing the piano at the church, and Tristan arrives. She sees that he's pretty beaten up. Like, he has got a bruise on his head, and at first he lies to her, saying that he just kind of got, he hit something in the house that he was in. And Ivy, though, tells him about the dream that he had, and Tristan gets really upset and essentially accidentally says that he fought Gregory outside of the cottage the night before. And then Will calls and says that he has found the exact way that Corinne had hid all of the pictures that she had on her computer, basically hiding them within Photoshop files. And what happens is, like, he uncovers basically the transaction notes that Corinne had made of not only Brian, but Tony, her former friend and confidant who had fixed Brian's car. They even found a picture of Brian's car with the VIN number and the license plate that was on it as well. And when Will comes over to see them to bring this information, obviously, he and Tristan finally, like, make up, because Will realizes now that this is Tristan, not Luke, and he's like, dude, I'm sorry, you know, I didn't know it was you, and Tristan's like, how can I repay you for all this, and Will's like, well, dude, we're kind of even, like, we're good, like, don't bring it up anymore, we're done with that. Ivy again refuses to stay with Tristan, even though it's probably the best idea, but she says that she's going to go find him tomorrow, and hopefully they'll get everything sorted out soon. When they get back to the inn, Beth talks to Will and Ivy about seeing Chase and how he's not doing so well, but she's going to try to help him. And Will, being the sweet guy he is, tries to be nice about the fact that she's kind of hanging out with Chase and trying to make him feel better, even though he's a little jealous about it because he likes her a lot and he cares about her. He basically flubs up his words and makes Beth really upset. And Ivy's like, go after her and tell her how you feel. This is getting ridiculous. Then in chapter 17, Ivy has this vision while she and Tristan are at the cemetery visiting the grave of the boy who was killed at the very beginning of this book. And she has this waking vision where she sees the cemetery that both Tristan's body is in and Gregory's body, and it basically leads her to his grave, and it causes her to almost get run over by a van in the cemetery, and they don't know what's going on with that. And then when Tristan ends up going on his own, he ends up getting basically kidnapped by Gregory and drugged and taken somewhere. And then Ivy gets a call from her brother Philip, who tells her that his treehouse was burned to the ground, and he says that he saw Gregory do it. So Ivy decides she's going to hightail it all the way over to him and calls out to Lacey to hopefully watch over him at least until Ivy gets there. But then Lacey comes up and she's like, where's Tristan? Have you got a hold of him at all? Because I don't know what's going on with him. And Ivy's like, you know what? He's fine. He should be. I'm not worried about him right now. I'm just worried about getting back to my brother. Then chapter 18, Tristan wakes up and basically he's trapped in this mausoleum in the cemetery that he's buried in and Gregory's buried in. And he realizes that Gregory's hatching a plan to kill Ivy here. And this is not good. So he calls out to Lacey, hoping that she can come and help him. Then Ivy gets to her brother and she is helping him. Philip tells her that Lacey was there for a time, but said that she had to go help Tristan. And Ivy realizes that he's at the cemetery. Gregory took him to the cemetery, and that's where she needs to go. And when she gets there, she sees Tristan hanging by the statue, and she goes to try to help him, but she doesn't realize that that's not really Tristan. Tristan's in the mausoleum. Gregory's created this thing that she thinks is Tristan because it's a way for him to try to get her to accidentally kill herself. And when she realizes that that's not really Tristan, she does go and find him, and Gregory comes out and they get into an altercation to the point where there's this storm that's coming in and the lightning strikes this really big tree and it's tipping over. It's gonna hurt people. So in order to save Tristan, who Ivy realizes she was never meant to be with, she pushes him out of the way and lets the tree take herself and Gregory. The reasoning behind this is because the whole thing with their relationship is it's all about this idea of not messing with God's plan. There's a whole thing within this about God's plan and whether it's something that we have free will over, all these things. And what Ivy realizes is that over the course of this, we see a couple different times where she starts to question whether or not they're meant to be together and if it's worth continuing, because she doesn't know if either she's going to be able to protect him or if she's supposed to die, essentially. And she comes to the realization in a split second that if she's going to get rid of Gregory for once and for all, she either has to let Tristan die again and risk the idea of him being then therefore eternally damned, let Tristan kill Gregory and for sure damn his soul, or die with Gregory so that at least Tristan will be safe, but Gregory will be gone. And it's not the most amazing of things, but that's what happens. And this is, I think, where my sister and I had really not liked the way this story had ended, because really the last chapter, the only thing that happens in the last chapter is really you see the family. It's about 3 months after everything that happened. Beth and Will went to New York for school, and they meet up with Philip and Tristan back home, and you kind of just learn where everybody is, and that's kind of it. Like, that's the last chapter of Everafter. But so here is the issue that my sister and I really had with this ending in the first place, because remember, I first read this entire series with her when I was in high school, when she was like in middle school, something like that. We hated the way that this ended, because to us it was really unfair that Ivy died in this way, that we kind of had wanted this happily ever after. And I still believe she didn't necessarily have to die. I think that there could have possibly been another way for this whole thing to go. But I also realize that the fact of the matter is that there's this kind of setup over the course of the series where there's this warning of not messing with God's plan. Lacey, especially over this second trilogy, not so much the first trilogy because it's not really a big thing then, but in the second trilogy, she makes it a very clear warning multiple times that you don't mess with his plan, you don't mess with what he's got, because everything's supposed to happen the way it does. And that brings into a question a lot of the, debate that goes on in in Christianity of whether we do have free will as humans if there is supposedly this overarching plan that this God or deity of some kind has over us. And I think that that's kind of more what's supposed to happen with this ending, is we're supposed to understand that neither of them were supposed to stay alive. Originally, obviously, it was Tristan who was supposed to die, and his plan was to save Ivy from Gregory and cause his death. It wasn't supposed to be that Tristan was supposed to come back and then also take over some other person's body. And it also wasn't supposed to happen that Gregory was supposed to be able to come back and take over bodies and people that Ivy cared about. But the thing is that I think at a very young age, reading this for the first time, being very romantic in terms of the idea of wanting there to be happily ever after and having the love interests be together, because that was kind of how things had been set up for several other series I had read by that point that had a similar kind of star-crossed lovers almost kind of story. It kind of set up this expectation in my head that made it impossible for me to really understand more of the nuances within this. And even now, as a 24-year-old woman, having read more stories like that, and I think also having a little bit more understanding of some aspects of religion, not a lot, but some of at least the way that religion is discussed in terms of the doctrine and what people of the faiths, they talk about. There is an element in this that I feel like I grasp a little bit easier, because that makes this death a little bit more understandable. It doesn't mean I like it by any means. I still think that there could have been a way for Ivy to live and Gregory to still die and Tristan to possibly live, or maybe, actually die and go into the light like he was supposed to. I'm not sure. I'm sure there was a way to do something like that. But the choice of having Ivy die was a very risky one, I will say. So I can guarantee that this was not something that was done lightly, and I think was a very hard decision to come to, and I can appreciate that more as an adult, I think, now than I ever could have done when I was in high school. So I really liked the way I think that this went. My biggest gripe, and because that wasn't really necessarily the reason I was giving it a 4-star, my biggest gripe with this is, again, this should have been one long book. All 3 of these books in the second trilogy should have been one book, because if you read this by itself, this entire book is the conclusion obviously, to the entirety of the trilogy and the entirety of the 6-book series. But the way that this reads, it's even more apparent that it was supposed to be the ending to a story. So it just kind of makes sense to me to have had the first 3 books put together as one book and the second set of 3 books put together as one book, kind of similar to how I had felt with the Thirst series. Overall, I really liked the pacing of this too. I felt like it was very similar to how Everlasting was. The last 50 pages, for instance, were like really intense. And even before that, things got very intense pretty quickly. And I think that's because it was riding so closely on the coattails of Everlasting, which had picked up a lot of intensity because the mystery was being built, there was a lot of suspense being built up, there was a lot more to do with Gregory's involvement, and Evercross was kind of just this weird middle book syndrome-esque book where it was the beginning of a new story, but you only had little bits and pieces of things developing here and there because the main point of Evercross was seeing Ivy and Tristan come together in this new way, and then the real meat of the story picks up in Everlasting, and Evercross is kind of the ending part to all of that, where it honestly just felt like they took the entire ending of what could have been Everlasting and just threw it into a 258-page book. It doesn't feel like it's supposed to be its own book, and it's kind of aggravating because I feel like it just would have sold so much better as a full-on book as opposed to 3 separate installments. And it just kind of aggravates me that YA used to do this so often, but it makes me happy that now we don't see that so much anymore. I think in terms of my thoughts overall on the series, because now that I've finished the entirety of my reread series of Kissed by an Angel, it doesn't age as well as I would have hoped, truthfully. And that's because, like I said, there's so much about it that doesn't 100% feel the same. It doesn't feel the same as when I did the first time reading it, but in all honesty, it is something that I think could be revamped for a more modern audience. There's so many ways you're able to revamp this story to make it a little bit more timeless, a little bit more accessible to other people, especially that are younger now. And I just feel like that the way that the story's written, though, it's just, you can tell it's an old story. You can tell it's from the 90s. You can tell that, you know, it's kind of cheesy and almost rom-com-y, not quite, not to the point where like it's anything like our adult romances today where it's actually kind of fun and adorable. It's kind of just a little cringy at times, but I still found it to be really enjoyable to reread because it did bring back a lot of memories of reading it for the first time with my younger sister and remembering how much I loved the idea of Ivy and Tristan, because their love in the original series you saw was very pure and honest, and it was innocent. And to see it go through the things it went through in the first trilogy and then in the second trilogy, especially with Everafter, it kind of just made you hopeful for the kind of love that they have. Just the amount of love that I had for Ivy and Tristan as a couple was something that I think still existed in this reread series. I still found them to be a little sickeningly cute, but very much a couple that I respected a lot. But I guess in terms of like what my overall rating of the series would be, I would say it's somewhere between like a 3.5 to 3.75. I don't quite know 100% really the average because I haven't totaled up the star ratings as of yet. I will leave the average rating for the series here if you're interested in that. But just based on feeling, it's about a 3.5, 3.75 because it wasn't bad by any means. I just think that, like I said, it's definitely aged. It's not 100% what I would want from it today, but it is something that if somebody were to adapt it into like a new modern setting, it very easily could be. If you guys have read Everafter yourself, the concluding novel in the Kissed by an Angel series by Elizabeth Chandler, let me know what your thoughts were down in the comments below. How did you feel about Ivy's death? I feel like it's one of those very polarizing deaths because of the fact that like there's so many people who didn't want this kind of an ending. I feel like I might be one of the only people that understand now as an adult the reasoning behind Ivy's death, but I totally still understand the anger and the frustration that is there because I still feel that. I just think I have a little bit more clarity and understanding on it. But anyway, thank you guys so much for joining me in this reading vlog. If you guys did enjoy it, please do give it a big thumbs up. And if you haven't already and you'd like to be and would like to see more content like this, go ahead and hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock. And I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye guys!